What if Bobby Kennedy became president? Over 40 years ago, or precisely 49 years ago, Robert Kennedy, a younger brother of John F. Kennedy, was shot dead by a Palestinian national. That event forever changed American history. But what if Kennedy had never been shot that day? Could he have become the president of the United States? And if he were to become the president, how different would history be? Well, those are all questions that we will seek to answer in this video. We must first understand why Kennedy was assassinated. On the 5th of June 1968, shortly after winning the primaries in California against another competitor for the Democratic Party nominee, Eugene McCarthy, Kennedy was shot dead by Sirhan Sirhan. No, I am not making his name up. A Palestinian Arab, Sirhan was a devoted anti-Zionist, or opposed to the state of Israel. As such, when he found out that Bobby supported Israel, he vowed to kill the man, and killed him precisely 1 year after the Six-Day War began in 1967. So what if Sirhan never shot the man? Could Bobby have become the next president? Well, this is probably one of the hardest questions to answer in alternate history, because some people argue that Bobby could have won, while others say that he couldn't have. The people that say he would have won the Democratic nomination note his charisma and popularity among JFK supporters. Perhaps this could have been enough for him to win. Some also say that Mayor Daley of Chicago pledged his support for Kennedy, and perhaps that would have been enough to boost his momentum. And if he survived the bullet of Sirhan, perhaps he would have received a large boost in popularity, similar to the John Hinckley shooting of Reagan. However, all of this is speculation. There's a lot more solid evidence going for his competitors for the Democratic nomination, especially Hubert Humphrey. In our timeline, Humphrey was the one that won the Democratic nomination. He was the preferred pick of the Democratic Party bosses, and back in those days, the party bosses were the most powerful people in the party. The Democratic Party was not reformed until 4 years later. So, there wasn't too much going for Kennedy. Even President Johnson supported Humphrey, who was his vice president, in running for president. Combined with the fact that McCarthy was adamant about staying in the race, and Bobby is facing a lot of stiff opposition. So it is hard to say if Bobby could have won. He had won the key state of California, and perhaps could have gained his home state of New York. However, even if he managed to go over the hurdles and win the Democratic nomination, that doesn't mean he's president. He still has to go up against Nixon, who would likely be the biggest opponent to becoming president. Nixon had built up a silent majority of middle-class whites. These whites were afraid of blacks and hippies, and wanted a more conservative government. However, Bobby was basically the polar opposite of that, being a voice for the disadvantaged and poor. I mean, the man was speaking in ghettos shortly before his assassination. So Bobby was more of a voice for the poor than Nixon was. In our timeline, the election between Humphrey and Nixon was very close. So close that it could have been the same case in our timeline, but in favor of the Democrats. If Bobby were to win the election, which may or may not be possible if the young and poor turned out for him, how different would the world be? Well, a bit different. I can say that confidently. Let's talk about the Vietnam War. Nixon, in our timeline, began a process of Vietnamization, or pulling out American troops while also bringing in more Vietnamese troops. This eventually failed, however, when the North Vietnamese overran the South in 1975. Kennedy would likely do the same thing, and try to bring a peace treaty between the North and the South. However, it is likely that this would fail, and much like in our timeline, the North would take over the South. Kennedy, however, will not engage in bombing runs over Cambodia as Nixon did. Kennedy was for the de-escalation of the war, and I think he would place a greater emphasis on domestic policy rather than foreign policy. The Vietnam War would be over much more quickly than in our timeline, by at least a few years. This means that although Kennedy wouldn't try to attack communist nations such as China, he wouldn't engage in a visit to the nation like Nixon did. This was the key factor that began an easing of relations between the communist and capitalist nations. Without that visit, the Cold War tensions would remain high throughout the late 60s and early 70s. Domestic policy, however, would be the main difference between the two men. While Nixon wasn't too outspoken about civil rights and really didn't try to push it ahead, Kennedy would be the exact opposite. He was a loud advocate for civil rights, and when he was Attorney General, he was a fierce opponent of segregation. If he were to become president, he would likely hire many minority workers in the federal government and actively prosecute corrupt Southern officials. Kennedy did not support racism or segregation at all, and said that it was the law to desegregate, noting the 1954 landmark court case, Brown versus Board of Ed. Civil rights would become the defining factor of Kennedy's administration, more than anything else. Advances for minority rights would be won many years before they were won in our timeline. This also comes with more chaos and violence, as whites against desegregation engage in backlash against government policies. We could see federal agents clashing with Southern whites on numerous occasions in this timeline, as Kennedy wasn't afraid of sending in the feds to enforce his orders. I think he would be a one-term president. His radical liberal views on civil rights would be a bit too early for America, and I think that would make him unfavorable, especially in the South. However, America would have been changed forever by the charismatic young president, who would have overseen more social programs and benefits for the disadvantaged and helped move America to a true land of freedom and liberty for all peoples. That concludes our What If Bobby Kennedy Was Never Killed scenario. Like and subscribe for more great content, and tell us any suggestions you have in the comments for future video ideas. Thanks for watching.